Hi, this is Tom. I'm with Kaiser University, and I'm going to do a brief presentation talking about intelligence testing. In the video today, we're going to go over different definitions of intelligence, some of the more common ones used today, and cultural and societal issues. So first, we have to establish what is intelligence. Now, this is really important because it will determine how it's going to be measured. And we have to remember that a culture's beliefs, values, and norms will influence how intelligence is defined. For instance, an indigenous culture might value fishing, and they might measure intelligence by how many fish a person can identify, or they might measure it by how many fish a person catches in a day. On the other hand, another culture that values space exploration might measure intelligence by a person's science and math ability. The first person to really test mental abilities was Sir Francis Galton. Galton noticed success ran in families and came to the conclusion that a person's ability to be successful was a product of intelligence, and that intelligence was something inherited from your parents. He thought he could test a person's intelligence through their senses by measuring things like reaction time to certain stimuli or the ability to recognize really high or low sounds, for example. He thought if someone could hear these high notes and had fast reaction times, this was a product of their mental ability. Ultimately, this was not a good way to test intelligence. For example, if we look at Beethoven in the later years of his life when he lost his ability to hear, he would still write complete symphonies and even direct the orchestra, and was highly intelligent even though he had lost his ability to hear. Because of his belief that intelligence was hereditary, Galton was also known for the eugenics movement, which is the belief that society should breed persons with the strongest traits and discourage those with lesser traits from procreating. Basically, it's population control and human breeding to build a superior race. Later, a man named Charles Spearman noticed persons who did well on one type of test seemed to also do well on similar tests. Through a method he pioneered called factor analysis, Spearman proposed that these different tests were all measuring a common factor or general intelligence, which is denoted by the lowercase g. The first person to create what we would consider an intelligence test today was Alfred Binet. During the 10th century, France decided that all kids had to go to school. Now, this is not a novel idea to us today, but the idea of public school is really quite recent when looking at human history. So now all of a sudden in Paris, you have all these students that have limited schooling or maybe no schooling that are now entering the education system, so they needed a way to identify which students needed more help. By using small sample groups, he created a norm for each age group, and scores yielded what he called a mental age. So a person who scores at an 8-year-old level, regardless of their chronological age, would be said to have a mental age of 8. Building on this concept of mental age, a man named Louis Terman took Binet's test and brought it to the US with a few changes, calling it the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Test. This test was used for immigration purposes and military selection. Besides translating it to English and changing a few items, Terman also changed the scoring to what is called an IQ or an intelligence quotient. IQ was calculated by dividing a person's mental age by their chronological age and multiplying it by 100. So a person with a mental age of 15, who also had a chronological age of 15, would score an IQ of 100. A person with a mental age higher than their chronological age would have an IQ above 100, or a mental age below their chronological age would yield a score below 100. Criticisms of the Stanford-Binet include cultural bias, unfair use, and inaccuracy for adults. Testing bias was against immigrants who weren't familiar or exposed to culture within the U.S., or who couldn't understand or speak the language well. For instance, a culturally biased item might be to identify the position in football for the person who hikes and throws the ball. This item would only be valid and reliable for persons within the U.S. who were familiar with the sport. In the rest of the world, football is called soccer and has completely different positions. The test was also used to support policies of eugenics that we discussed earlier. In 1924, the state of Virginia passed a law legalizing forced sterilization for persons deemed feeble-minded. Additionally, scoring was insensitive for adults. Because there are significant differences developmentally between a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, IQ scores were meaningful. However, for adults, there's very little difference between a 44-year-old and, say, a 41-year-old. These limitations were addressed by a man named David Wechsler when he created the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale in 1939. At the time, Wechsler was working for Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan, New York, and needed an accurate method to measure intelligence for their multicultural clientele. To do this, he introduced the concept of nonverbal items or performance items to measure intelligence, for example, using pattern recognition. His tests included 6 verbal and 5 nonverbal subtests, with items increasing in difficulty. He theorized that each subtest measured a separate individual intelligence. He also changed the scoring by using standard deviations with a bell curve. Briefly, I wanted to touch on Howard Gardner and his work. Similar to Wechsler, Howard Gardner believed in separate intelligences and created the theory of multiple intelligences. He proposed 8 separate intelligences that operate independent of each other. For example, someone could be really high in mathematical intelligence, but really low in interpersonal intelligence. According to Cohen and Swerdlick, 2018, his work has significantly impacted education strategies that teach material through multiple modes to complement these different intelligences. However, the authors noted that studies have shown empirical evidence of correlations between these different intelligences, or a common G factor. The 2 most popular intelligence tests used today are the Stanford-Binet and the WAIS. Now, the WAIS has a children and preschool and primary scale, but we're going to focus on the adult scales. The most recent version of the Stanford-Binet is the SB5. It's for ages 2 up to 85, with 5 separate subtests that are supposed to correlate to a general intelligence or G factor. Norming was done by a sample of 4,800 participants between the ages of 2 and 85, matching the 2000 U.S. Census data for demographics. The full-scale score can be converted to the following nominal categories often used to diagnose developmental disabilities, like in education settings that allow IEPs for specific students. This highlights one of the concerns with test validity and reliability of the SB5. A student might see an IEP as an easier option and purposely do poorly on the test. Also, it is difficult to compare reliability between age groups since each has a different set of items. The test takes approximately 50 minutes to be administered, and it has received criticism due to the shorter attention span of younger children, and is limited to participants without hearing, speech, or motor skill impairments. For children, test users need to be aware of cultural bias, since the test consists of certain what they call manipulatives, like toys and visual aids, used to engage the test taker. I have a friend with a 2- and 4-year-old that both use iPhones constantly. Children who spend a lot of time on iPhones and tablets would likely score lower than children that are not used to playing with those types of toys. The other commonly used intelligence test is the Wk7. It includes 4 subtests that are individually administered that include verbal and nonverbal sections, for instance, vocabulary and visual puzzles. The Wk7 used a stratified sample of 2,200 participants representative of the US population. Besides having a smaller sample size than the Stanford Binet 5, critics of the Wk7 argue that it lacks criterion-related validity and utility for diagnosing intellectual disabilities. Intelligence testing requires an awareness of cultural values and context of test items and the test taker. This cartoon humorously shows how someone from the 60s, who I'm guessing is a hippie because of the peace sign on his back, sees a bomb, but the environmentalist on the right, he sees a tree. Thanks for watching.